Welcome back, Riders, to the Sword and the Ring, where we talk all sorts of lore with a focus on Alagaesia, Hogwarts, Middle-earth, and a galaxy far, far away. Today, we continue our history of the Riders with the last living rider and dragon hidden from Galbatorix at the time of Eragon. Oromis was an elf raised along the banks of Lake Tidustin. When he turned 20, he was presented the dragon eggs that had been given to the elves. Glaedr hatched for him, and they quickly formed a bond. Glaedr was a rash and stubborn young dragon who, at one point, even broke the top off of a mountain. Yes, the top off of a mountain. Despite this, or maybe because of it, Oromis and Glaedr were eventually appointed to teach the next generations of riders and dragons. So the pair settled in Illyria and took on a student or two at a time for years. This continued until the fall of Galbatorix, which I covered in more detail in this video. Oromis was a member of the Rider Council who denied the Madden Riders' request for another dragon. After a tragic series of events, Galbatorix disappeared in the spine, and the Riders went back to business as usual for some time. Now, Oromis and Glaedr would take on two of their most important pupils as they trained both Morzan and Braum with their dragons. That is covered in this video. After their tutelage ended with Morzan's betrayal, the pair continued mentoring Braum and Saphira, and life was seemingly normal again. However, word began to spread that riders and dragons were going missing, and Oromis and Glaedr became uneasy. Their attempts to convince the Rider Council went unheeded, so the pair went out to perform their own investigation with two other young riders. Unfortunately, the two riders had already been poisoned by Galbatorix and Morzan, and were members of the Forsworn. When Glaedr landed at a resting stop, a magical trap was activated, and the two traitors jumped into action, casting spells to mute and bind the older rider and dragon. They then released the original trap and attempted to convince the Golden Dragon and his rider to join Galbatorix in their attack on Illyria. Of course, the loyal dragon and rider could not be convinced, and a fight broke out. With the aid of a stolen Eldunari, the two Forsworn were able to hold their own, so Oromis was forced to do something extremely risky. He rearranged the very matter that made up himself and Glaedr and shifted it just enough to break the effect of the binding and muting spells. However, this triggered a debilitating genetic disease which led to Oromis becoming incapacitated with a fit. At the same time, one of the Forsworn cast a spell that wrapped itself around Oromis' mind and would not allow him to cast his normally powerful magic. The two fled after Glaedr was able to incapacitate one of the Forsworn, but during the ensuing chase, the other Forsworn swung their sword at the clutched form of Oromis. Glaedr jerked and moved to intercept the sword, and the swing instead took off Glaedr's left front leg. This actually aided the pair's retreat, as the loss of the extra weight allowed Glaedr to outpace the other dragons. Oromis was able to staunch the flow of the blood from the wound, but could not fully heal the leg or warn the other riders from the vast distance. When the two got back to Illyria, they found that most of the riders had already left to search for Galbatorix or to speak with the oldest of their order, Vrail, on Vrowengard. Not being much use in a fight at this point, the two went with Braum and Saphira to do Weldenvarden and tried to convince their students to stay out of the fight. However, the pair could not be convinced and soon left. Oromis and Glaedr had one last part to play in the war against Galbatorix before the events of the inheritance cycle. Although the pair would never remember doing this, they helped construct and plan the defense of the Vault of Souls, which would eventually lead to the downfall of Galbatorix and the empire he would create. The vault holds many secrets and would be hidden by both magic and physical means. We'll look into this later with Eragon and Saphira. This concludes the history of the four most influential riders through the fall of the Riders. Next, we'll be branching out to the rest of the resistance to Galbatorix's reign. Let me know who or what else you want me to scour the libraries of Illyria for before we begin our journey with a young farm boy. I'll be with you next time on the Sword and the Ring.